clock on the wall reads 9:55 p.m. I've been behind the mic at WZRN for longer than I care to admit. Over the years, I've grown accustomed to the dead quiet of the station at night. Only the hum of old equipment and the occasional crackle from the speakers break the silence. The familiar glow of the control room lights is like a second home. Tonight felt like just another night, the usual playlist, the usual banter, the usual calm. I adjusted the fader, checked the levels, and let the opening track spill through the speakers. The comforting warmth of music filled the space, but tonight, something felt off. It's hard to describe, but it wasn't the music or the environment, it was the air itself. A kind of stillness had settled over the station, and with it, an inexplicable tension. I adjusted the volume on the console and pressed a button to cue the next song. That's when I heard it. A faint crackling, like static, barely perceptible over the sound of the track. I paused. It wasn't the usual hum of the equipment malfunctioning, it was something different. The static wasn't constant, it pulsed and sputtered in a way I'd never heard before. I reached over to the control board, toggling switches and knobs, trying to get rid of the interference. I didn't want to break the flow of the show, but it was becoming impossible to ignore. The static grew louder, thickening the air with an eerie hiss. My fingers danced over the buttons, but no matter what I did, it only seemed to get worse. At first, I thought maybe it was a transmitter issue. That wasn't uncommon, but the longer I listened, the more unsettling it became. The frequency wasn't just filled with static, it had a strange rhythm, like a faint, distorted voice trying to break through. I frowned, pressing the monitor button to listen in on the broadcast. The static was overpowering, drowning out the music. I leaned closer to the speakers, hoping for a clue about the source of the noise. Then, just as I was about to give up, a low whisper sliced through the static. "It's coming. You're not ready." I froze. The voice was muffled, distorted by the interference, but it was unmistakable. The tone was calm, almost soothing, if not for the warning buried in its words. I immediately pulled my headphones off, checking the console for any signs of malfunction. Nothing. The equipment seemed fine. I glanced at the soundboard again, tapping the mic to make sure it was functioning. But the static was still there. The whispering voice didn't stop, it only became clearer. "You can't stop it. It's already here." My pulse quickened, my fingers instinctively reaching for the cut button, but the voice continued, almost mocking me. I swallowed hard. It felt like the air itself had turned heavy, pressing against my chest. It was as if the station had transformed into something else, a hollow shell that had been overtaken by something sinister. The cryptic warning was enough to make my stomach churn, but there was no one else in the station to confirm what I was hearing. The entire place was quiet, empty, save for me and whatever had invaded the airwaves. I ran my hands over the controls, desperately trying to clear the static. It only grew more intense, like an electrical storm building up inside the equipment. The whispering voice was louder now, clearer. "This place is cursed. The disaster is inevitable. They are coming for you." The words were chilling, too specific, too personal. I didn't know what to make of them, but they felt real. It was as though whoever, or whatever, was speaking knew exactly where I was. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, a wave of cold creeping over me. I tapped the mic. "Is anyone out there?" My voice crackled through the airwaves, but there was no response. The voice on the other end seemed to be growing stronger, louder, as if feeding off the energy in the room. "The signal is already weak. They've been here before. You won't be the last." The static became unbearable, ringing in my ears like my entire body was vibrating with the sound. I hit the off switch, cutting the feed. The silence that followed was suffocating. For a long moment, I just stood there, the station as quiet as it had been before, except now there was a feeling of dread settling over the room like a thick fog. I checked the transmitter again. Everything seemed fine, but that couldn't be right. The voice was still so clear in my mind, like it had been branded into my brain. I turned the lights down low, trying to steady my nerves. The only sound now was the faint hum of the station's equipment, as though everything was functioning normally again. But I couldn't shake the feeling. I wanted to believe it was just a glitch, some random malfunction. But the voice, the warning, it felt too real. Too precise. I sat back down in the chair, my fingers trembling as I reached for the playlist. But the static, that whisper, it was still with me, gnawing at the edges of my thoughts. I wanted to shake it off. I told myself it was nothing, just a malfunction I'd figure out later. But deep down, something told me that I wouldn't be able to ignore it. Something was definitely off. The first few nights after the initial transmission felt normal again, but I could never quite shake the feeling that something was wrong. I tried to brush it off. After all, I had been working the graveyard shift for years. I had seen a lot of things that didn't quite make sense, especially when you're alone in the dead of night, surrounded by nothing but static and low-frequency hums. But the voice, it stuck with me. The warning, the feeling of being watched. It lingered in the back of my mind like a dark cloud, slowly suffocating any sense of comfort I'd ever had at the station. Night 2, the static returned. I had already queued up the opening track, Echoes of Silence, a fitting title, I thought, given the stillness in the air. As the first beat dropped, a flicker of static interrupted it, barely audible, but there. I instinctively reached for the controls, making sure everything was in order. But just like before, no malfunction showed up on the meters. Everything was normal, yet that feeling, that chill in my bones, wasn't. And then, it happened. They're closer now. Do you feel it? The voice, soft yet sharp, cut through the static. This time, it was clearer, familiar, almost. The words felt personal, like they were meant for me, and me alone. I froze, my hand hovering above the controls as if I was waiting for something, or someone, to jump out of the shadows. But nothing. Just the soft hum of the equipment and the faint echo of the voice lingering in the air. I immediately hit the cut button, but the static was relentless. The frequency crackled louder, drowning out the song, and the voice returned, this time louder, more urgent. The storm is coming. The trees will fall, and you'll be trapped in the dark. Do you see them watching you? They're waiting. My pulse quickened. I had no idea what to make of it. A prank? A glitch? But then something in the voice, it didn't sound like either. It sounded too deliberate, too precise. The words were too specific, too chilling. I checked the equipment again. Everything was fine, but my fingers were shaking. I told myself to breathe, to focus. It's just a malfunction. It has to be. But even as I repeated this to myself, I couldn't ignore the gnawing feeling in the back of my head. Someone, or something, was watching me. It wasn't just a voice. The air in the station had grown thick, heavy with a kind of oppressive silence. I turned the lights up, suddenly feeling a need for illumination. I didn't like the dark. I hadn't felt like that in years. I wasn't alone in that room anymore. I was being watched. and I knew it wasn't just in my head. That night, the broadcast ended without incident. But it was different. The unease didn't leave. It followed me home. I couldn't shake the feeling of eyes on me, following me through the halls, down the streets. I kept checking behind me, half expecting to see someone standing in the shadows. Night 3 came, and so did the static. The pattern was almost the same as before, but this time, the voice was clearer than ever. You think it's over, but it's only beginning. Look out the window. They're already here. Do you see them? You're not alone. I froze mid-broadcast. I hadn't touched the window since I started this shift. I felt an overwhelming urge to look, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. I had checked earlier, just as I always did, to make sure everything was secure. But now, the voice, its certainty, it gnawed at me, pulled at me. I grabbed my jacket, stood up, and walked toward the small window next to the control booth. I hesitated, but something inside me urged me to look. As I peeked through the blinds, there was nothing but the empty street below. No shadows, no figures lurking in the distance. Just the same quiet street that had been there for years. Yet, I couldn't shake the sensation that someone, somewhere, was watching me. I returned to my seat, trying to clear my mind. I dismissed it, telling myself I was just tired. Maybe the voice was a late-night prank, a twisted joke someone was playing on me. But then, my phone buzzed on the desk, just once. I glanced at it, half expecting a text from a friend or a notification, but when I unlocked the screen, my blood ran cold. It was a message from a number I didn't recognize. The trees are moving, aren't they? They're closer than you think. You haven't seen the worst of it yet. My hand trembled as I dropped the phone on the desk, my mind racing. I hadn't told anyone about the strange transmissions. How could anyone know? It was impossible. Then it hit me. I had just received a message that mirrored the very same words the voice had spoken earlier. The trees are moving. I hadn't even mentioned it to anyone, and yet here it was, in a text. I tried to push the thought out of my mind. I had to focus. I had to finish my shift. But as I looked out the window again, the streetlights flickered. A dark shape moved in the distance, its silhouette barely visible in the dim light. My heart skipped a beat. Was someone out there? Was this part of some elaborate prank, or was this something worse? The storm is almost here. You can't hide from them. They will come for you. I hadn't touched the microphone. The voice filled the room, without warning, as if it had been waiting for the perfect moment. It wasn't coming from the speakers anymore, it was coming from everywhere, reverberating through the walls, through my bones. I felt the room closing in, the walls constricting with every word. My breathing became shallow as I glanced around, desperate for an explanation. There was no source. No one in the building. Just me. And whatever this voice was. Suddenly, I heard a soft scraping sound. It was faint at first, but it grew louder. Something was moving outside the control room door, just out of sight. I turned toward it, my body rigid with fear. The door was locked. I was alone. And yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, something, was standing just beyond the threshold, waiting. The transmission cut off abruptly, leaving a deafening silence. My heart pounded in my chest as I stared at the door, but nothing came. No figure, no noise. Just that same unshakable feeling that I wasn't alone. Something was out there. But what? The nights started blending into one another, each shift more unsettling than the last. I couldn't stop thinking about the voice. It haunted me, tugged at my thoughts, keeping me awake long after my shift had ended. Every time I tried to get some rest, the words would echo in my head, "The storm is coming." It wasn't just the voice anymore, it was the feeling that something was drawing closer, inching toward me, with no way to stop it. I couldn't shake the idea that the voice knew things about me. Things no one should have known. The eerie details, the uncanny accuracy, it wasn't just coincidence. And I couldn't let it go. The more I thought about it, the more obsessed I became. I started spending my free time researching. My colleagues had always joked about how the radio station was built on some old forgotten land, a place that had seen its share of dark events. But I never thought much of it. Now, I had to know more. So, I dove in, scouring the archives of old broadcasts and digging through the history of the building. The first thing I came across was the station's early records, nothing too strange, just a list of broadcasts and a few mentions of some mishaps in the equipment. But then, I dug deeper. And that's when I found it. There had been several reports of accidents around the area. And not just any accidents, things that didn't add up. Fatal crashes on the nearby highway, unexplained disappearances in the woods behind the station, and local ghost stories that had been circulating for decades. One report in particular caught my eye. In 1983, a fire broke out in the building next door, claiming the lives of 2 radio hosts. It was deemed accidental, but strange events have been reported ever since. That was the same building that housed the old records, where the transmission equipment had once been before it was moved to the station's current location. I felt the chill run down my spine. The connection between the fire and the strange occurrences was too obvious to ignore. It wasn't just that the station was in an area with a dark history, it was built on it. But was that all it was? Or was something else going on, something that went far beyond accidents and ghost stories? I couldn't leave it alone. I had to know the truth. And so, I started researching the old news articles about the disappearances and mysterious deaths tied to the area. As I read through the chilling details, I started to notice something disturbing. Several of the people who had vanished had been connected to the station in one way or another. Either they worked here or were regular listeners. Their names kept appearing in the reports, and they all had one thing in common: they had been heard by someone before they disappeared. One by one, the chilling realization hit me. They had heard the voice. I kept listening to the transmissions, hoping for some kind of explanation, some way to make sense of it all. But as the days passed, the voice became clearer, more insistent. They can't protect you forever. The others are coming for you. The voice was unmistakable now, its timbre growing more familiar. And this time, it was different. It wasn't just a warning. It was an order. A command. Leave the station immediately. I couldn't ignore it anymore. The warnings were becoming more frantic. The voice was growing desperate. I knew I needed to leave, but the more I thought about it, the less I understood. What was happening? And why me? Then, something happened that made my skin crawl. I was alone in the control room, scrolling through old broadcast logs when I heard something outside. Footsteps. Slow, measured, the kind of footsteps you hear when someone's walking toward you, deliberate and calm. I froze, my heart racing. There was no one in the building but me. I had locked the doors, double-checked the security cameras. I was alone. I jumped to my feet, my eyes darting to the monitors, the window, the door. But there was nothing. Just the usual, the empty hallway outside, the darkened corners of the station. But the footsteps, they kept coming. I hurried to the hallway, my pulse pounding in my throat. There was no one. The hall was empty. I stood there for a moment, listening to the quiet. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it. A shadow flickered just at the edge of the hall, moving in the direction of the storage closet. I couldn't explain it. My feet moved on their own, and I found myself following it. But by the time I reached the closet, there was nothing, no shadow, no person. Just the same empty space I'd seen 100 times before. As I turned to leave, I heard something else. A voice, faint but distinct, just outside the storage room door. "You can't escape. They know you're here." It was the voice. The same one that had been speaking to me through the radio, only now, it was real. In the room with me. I stumbled back, my breath caught in my chest. The walls felt like they were closing in around me. I ran back to the control room, slamming the door behind me, locking it, as if that would somehow stop the voice, stop whatever was happening. I couldn't breathe. My hands were shaking, and I grabbed the microphone, desperate to hear any sign of normalcy. But the static was there again, cutting through the silence. Then, as if the transmission had been waiting for me, the voice crackled through, louder than ever. "It's too late to leave. They're already here. You're too deep now." I froze. That was it. The voice had just confirmed it. It wasn't just speaking to me through the airwaves anymore, it was following me. It knew everything about me. About everyone. I didn't know who they were, but at that moment, I realized with a sickening certainty that I was no longer just a witness to some strange phenomenon. I was part of it. Whatever was happening, whatever dark force had been pulling the strings, it had me now. And the worst part? I knew that I was running out of time. I couldn't explain it, but the longer I stayed in the station, the more I felt like I was losing myself. The paranoia started to eat at me, bit by bit. I kept hearing those footsteps, always behind me, always when I was alone. I started seeing things move on their own, a coffee mug shifting across the counter, the papers on my desk scattering when no one was around. It wasn't just in my head anymore. Something was out there. I was afraid to sleep. Afraid to close my eyes, because when I did, I could hear the whisper in the dark, "You're not alone." The voice was different that night. It was no longer a warning, it was a plea, a desperate cry from somewhere beyond the static, as if it knew something I didn't, something I couldn't even comprehend. "It's too late. The fire's already set. You're all going to burn." The words were chilling, more vivid than ever. The usual static was absent, replaced by a sharp, unsettling clarity that almost made my skin crawl. I froze, gripping the microphone, my heart pounding. I didn't know what to believe anymore. Was this a prank? Some twisted, elaborate hoax? Or was I on the brink of discovering something so terrible that the very air around me seemed to tremble with its weight? I couldn't shake the feeling that the voice knew something I didn't. And it was getting harder to ignore the connection between the warnings and the terrifying events unfolding around the station. The next morning, I couldn't stop thinking about the voice. I had to know more. I spent hours going through old station records, diving deep into every bit of history I could find. But the more I dug, the more I found myself questioning everything. There were whispers, scattered mentions here and there about the radio station's past. And they all pointed to one thing, an abandoned building nearby. It wasn't much of a stretch to think that this building might be tied to the station's history. It stood like a forgotten relic, dark and looming, just a few blocks away. Over the years, I'd heard rumors about it, mostly from the old-timers who used to work at the station, but no one ever said anything concrete. It was just there, an eyesore, a curiosity. But when I dug into its history, I found something that made my blood run cold. The building had once been an asylum, a large, sprawling complex with a dark reputation. It had been built in the early 1900s, a place meant to house the unwanted of society, those deemed insane, those with no place in the world. But in 1963, the asylum burned down in a fire so intense, so catastrophic, that it left nothing but ashes behind. The official cause was listed as accidental, a result of faulty electrical wiring. But there were rumors, whispers from the survivors, the staff, the few who had managed to escape the blaze. They said the fire wasn't an accident. They said it was set deliberately by someone inside the building. And the fire had consumed everything, the patients, the staff, the records, everything. But the most disturbing part of all was what came after. The building was abandoned. No one dared rebuild on the land, and the asylum was soon forgotten. But a few years later, construction crews were hired to clear the site for new developments. That was when the radio station was built, directly on top of the asylum's ruins. I couldn't ignore the connection. The radio station, the abandoned asylum, the fire, it all started to feel like a trap, a web of fate slowly closing in around me. And the more I learned, the more it became clear, the warnings were real. The voice, the predictions, it was all tied to something far darker than I had imagined. I knew I had to learn more, so I reached out to a few former employees of the station. People who had worked there long before me, people who had seen things, heard things, felt things. I needed answers. The first person I spoke to was Sarah, an old receptionist who had worked at the station for years before retiring. She was hesitant to speak at first, but after I mentioned the voice on the air, she went silent for a long time. Then, she said something that made my blood run cold. "You're not the first one to hear it," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "We all heard it at some point. I thought it was just the stress of working here, the isolation, you know? But then, it started happening to others. The strange accidents, the disappearances. People would start hearing things, whispers, voices, strange static, like it was coming from inside the walls." I asked her about the building next door, the asylum. Sarah's voice faltered. "I've heard the stories," she admitted. "Some of the staff from the old station used to talk about it. About how the fire wasn't an accident. They said the place was cursed by the people who died there. There were rumors about the patients, you know? Some of them never really left the place. They said their souls still haunted the land." Her words sent a chill down my spine. I had never heard anyone speak so candidly about the history of the building or the horrors it might have held. I pushed further. "What happened to the records? The ones from the asylum?" Sarah hesitated before responding. "There's something in the old records room. Something that was left behind, something no one talks about. But if you dig deep enough, you'll find it. It's a warning, just like the voice. And it's connected to the fire." I hung up the phone, my mind spinning. I had to go to that records room. I had to see for myself what Sarah was talking about. I couldn't ignore it anymore. That night, I waited until the station was quiet. I knew most of the staff would be gone by midnight, and the late night shifts were always the slowest. I slipped out of the control room and made my way down the hall to the back storage area where the old records were kept. The door creaked as I pushed it open, and a rush of cold air hit me. The room was dark, the only light coming from the flickering bulb overhead. I shivered, stepping inside, my footsteps muffled by the dust-covered floor. The shelves were lined with rows of old files, boxes, and ancient equipment that hadn't been touched in years. But I wasn't looking for just anything, I was looking for the truth. As I began to sift through the boxes, I came across something that made my stomach turn. A file, old and yellowed with age, bearing the station's logo. The label was smudged, but I could make out the words, Asylum Records, Confidential. I opened the file carefully, my hands trembling. Inside were newspaper clippings, photographs, and handwritten notes. The photos showed the asylum before the fire, patients lined up outside, the imposing stone walls, the eerie quiet that seemed to hang in the air. But the most chilling part were the notes, written in the same shaky hand. The fire was not an accident. It was started by one of them, someone who didn't want to be forgotten. The souls of the lost will never rest. As I read those words, I felt a deep unease settle over me. Something was awakening. Something old, something dangerous. And it was tied to the station, to me, to all of us. Suddenly, the voice crackled through the static again, this time louder, clearer, more urgent than ever. It's already begun. The fire, this time, it won't be stopped. You're in the path. Leave now, while you still can. I slammed the file shut, my heart racing. This wasn't just some random series of events. The station was more than a broadcast point, it was a gateway to something far darker. And now, it was calling me, drawing me deeper into its web. I had to stop it. Before it was too late. The voice was louder tonight. It wasn't just a whisper or a static-filled murmur anymore. It was almost like it was inside my head, swirling around me like a tornado of sound. It was frantic in a way that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. You're running out of time. It wasn't a question. It wasn't a suggestion. It was a command, and it felt like the walls around me were closing in. I tried to breathe, tried to steady my hands as I fumbled with the equipment. The station's control room was eerily quiet, save for the occasional crackle of the transmission. The lights flickered overhead, adding to the unsettling atmosphere. My mind was racing. This was happening. This was real. I glanced at the clock on the wall, 2:37 a.m. The usual silence of the graveyard shift had taken on a new, oppressive tone. The air felt thicker tonight, like I was suffocating under a weight I couldn't see, but I could feel pressing down on my chest. Every time the voice spoke, it grew clearer, sharper. You're running out of time. The fire is coming. I couldn't explain it, but I knew something was going to happen. It wasn't just the words, it was the feeling. The voice was like a compass, pulling me toward a destination I didn't want to reach, but couldn't escape. I tried to tell myself it was all in my head. Stress, paranoia. I hadn't been sleeping well, and everything was starting to blur together. But then the lights flickered again. The hum of the radio equipment grew louder, like it was trying to scream at me. The transmission interrupted every few seconds with bursts of static. And then, again, the voice came through, colder than before, as if it were standing right next to me, breathing down my neck. You should have listened. It's too late now. I froze. The voice had never sounded so close. My heart skipped a beat, and I jerked my head toward the control room door. The place was empty. I was alone. But the voice wasn't done. It never was. The countdown has begun. You can't stop it. I jumped from my seat and rushed to the windows, looking out into the parking lot below, the empty streets beyond. The city was still, silent. Nothing had changed. Nothing was wrong. Yet everything felt wrong. I scrambled to gather myself. I needed to calm down, think. I was overreacting. It was just a transmission, a glitch, a prank, something explainable. But the more I tried to rationalize, the more I felt the panic rising in my chest. The static returned, louder, faster, more aggressive. And then the voice, cutting through the chaos. The first one is here. My hands trembled as I reached for the microphone. I couldn't take it anymore. I needed to tell someone, anyone. The voice had warned me so many times, and each warning had come closer to the truth, but no one at the station would listen. They all thought I was imagining things. They all thought I was going crazy. But tonight, I knew I wasn't imagining it. I wasn't crazy. Something was happening. I grabbed the phone, dialed the station manager's number, but the call went straight to voicemail. Of course. He was never around when I needed him most. I slammed the phone down and tried calling someone else, my friend, the old receptionist, Sarah, but the line was dead. The power flickered again, and I swore under my breath. This wasn't a coincidence anymore. This wasn't some faulty equipment. I was being watched. You can't stop it. It's already inside. I spun around, my heart hammering in my chest. I couldn't tell if it was the voice or my own fear making my head spin, but I felt like I was losing control. The walls seemed to close in, the room shrinking, suffocating me. The air grew thick, sticky, heavy with the weight of the unknown. I glanced at the monitors. The signal was fluctuating again, but this time the screen wasn't showing static, it was showing something else. A faint, blurry shape on the screen. I leaned in closer, my breath catching in my throat. For a moment, I thought I saw it, someone. But the image distorted, twisting and warping until it was just a flicker, gone in an instant. I shook my head, trying to clear the fog in my mind. I was losing it. The voice came again, louder, more insistent. The second one is here. My body went cold. I couldn't breathe. I turned quickly, glancing around the room like a cornered animal, waiting for something to happen. The chill in the air intensified, the sound of the transmission now distorted by an unnatural hum. It wasn't just the radio anymore. It was everywhere. I rushed to the door, my hand shaking as I tried to turn the knob. But it wouldn't budge. The door was locked. I pulled harder, my breath quickening in panic. I could feel it now, the presence, the thing that had been following me. It was here, in the room with me. I turned back to the control room, my heart racing. The monitors were all flashing now, one by one, each screen displaying something different. Static. Words. Numbers. And in the middle of it all, the faint, blurred outline of a figure. Then, as the clock ticked over to 3 a.m., the voice grew louder, almost deafening, as it filled every inch of the room. It was as if the walls themselves were screaming at me. You should have left. It's too late. I dropped to my knees, clutching my head in my hands. The static was too much. The voice was too much. It was all I could hear. The world around me was collapsing, falling apart, but I couldn't escape. The voice kept repeating the same thing over and over again. It's already inside. You're not getting out. I wanted to scream. I wanted to cry out for help, but there was no one left. No one to hear me. The building felt alive with something I couldn't explain. The sound of footsteps, faint but unmistakable, echoed through the hallway outside. They were close now, moving steadily, methodically. I jumped up and ran to the window, desperate to see something, anything, that would make sense of this nightmare. The streets were empty, but there was something else. Something in the shadows, just beyond the streetlights. A figure. A figure standing motionless, watching. I felt my throat tighten. I tried to scream, but the sound caught in my chest. I was trapped, locked inside the station, with no way out. The countdown was nearly over. And when it hit 0, whatever was coming, it would be too late to stop. I turned back to the monitors, and the figure on the screen was clear now, standing at the door of the station, waiting. It was too late. And I was stuck. The lights flickered for the last time. It was 3:27 a.m., and I could feel it, the weight of inevitability pressing down on me, suffocating me. I had thought I understood what was happening. I believed it was just a malfunction, a strange glitch in the system. A prank. But I was wrong. So terribly wrong. The radio station, this place, this haunted, decaying monument to whatever had been before, wasn't just a building. It was a vessel. It had been designed for something much darker, much older than I could have ever imagined. And now, it was too late. The static came through the airways again, thicker than ever. It was almost like the sound was crawling through the room, like the air itself was distorting. The voice, the one that had been tormenting me for weeks, the voice I had come to dread, came through again, but this time it wasn't just a warning. This time, it was a truth. It's you. You're the one who's going to do it. I froze. The voice, it wasn't just giving me cryptic messages anymore. It was talking to me, about me. And the worst part, the part that made my blood run cold, was that I knew, deep down, it was right. I was part of it. All of it. I was the cause of the disaster. You were the ritual. The broadcast was always meant to pull you in. I stumbled back from the console, my breath coming in ragged gasps. It couldn't be true. I had never asked for any of this. I hadn't even believed in any of this, not at first. The ghosts, the accidents, the strange disappearances, they had all seemed so distant, so irrelevant. But now they were real. The fire. The ritual. The station's dark, bloody history. The voice continued, its tone growing colder, sharper. You don't even realize, do you? The broadcast, the transmission, you're not just receiving it. You're creating it. My hands trembled as I gripped the edge of the control panel, trying to steady myself. This couldn't be happening. I had to be losing my mind. Every time you speak into that mic, you're feeding it. Every time you broadcast, you're drawing the ritual closer. Every time you try to stop it, you only push it forward. The walls of the control room felt like they were closing in. The air was thick with the sound of static, and the hum of the equipment, the buzz, the whir, was almost deafening. It was like the station itself was alive, vibrating with a dark energy that seemed to crawl under my skin. I wanted to run. I wanted to escape. But I couldn't. I was the station. I was tied to it. The power was flickering, struggling to stay alive, but I could feel it. Whatever was happening, it was coming to a head. And then, in a moment of clarity, I saw it. The twisted truth, the horrifying realization that shattered everything I had thought I knew. The broadcast wasn't just a signal from the past. It was a signal from the future. I was the one who had been broadcasting it all along. I had become the voice. I had been talking to myself, a future version of myself, warning me of the disaster I was destined to cause. I had been pulling myself toward this moment, toward the destruction that was now inevitable. The ritual had been happening all along, slowly, quietly, without me even realizing. And now it was reaching its climax. The station, this very place, was the center of it all. It wasn't just an accident. It was by design. It was meant to burn. The clock on the wall blinked 3:30 a.m., and I knew, without a shadow of a doubt, that in the next 30 minutes, it would all come crashing down. The voice, calm but insistent, spoke again, and this time, I could feel its presence physically, a weight pressing on my chest. You have a choice now. You can stop it. You can walk away, leave the station, and break the cycle. Or, you can let it happen. You can let the ritual complete itself. The disaster will come, and you will be the one to bring it. I looked around, my head spinning. The monitors were flickering, flashing images that made no sense. There was a fire, no, a shadow, moving across the screens, a figure that couldn't be real. But then it was, moving closer, growing more distinct with every passing second. The station's power surged again. The transmission wasn't just on the airwaves anymore. It was in everything, the walls, the equipment, my body. I could feel it coursing through me, wrapping around me like a dark, invisible thread. I ran to the door, slamming my hands against the locked handle. I couldn't get out. The building wouldn't let me leave. It had been pulling me in all along. You're not getting out. Not this time. I turned, and there it was. The figure from the screen, no longer a distorted shadow, but a man. His face was familiar, twisted in a way I couldn't fully place, but there was no doubt now. It was me. Or, rather, it was what I would become. I stumbled backward, gasping for air, trying to make sense of it all. The room seemed to warp, bend, and shift as though time itself was breaking apart. And then, I knew. I was already too late. The fire, the disaster, the ritual, it was all part of me. I had been pulling it toward me this whole time. It wasn't just a future event. It was a consequence of my own choices, of my own actions. The station, the people in it, the city, all of it was going to burn. And I was going to be the one who made it happen. The voice came one final time, and this time, it wasn't a warning. It wasn't a choice. It was a statement. It's done. The power surged one last time, and everything went black.